idea to do something a little different because for the last, I would say about month or so, Pascal and I kind of off and on have been having these conversations about New York in the 80s and 90s. And originally, one of the video essays, I think I want to say the Cosby one, was going to have a lot more New York footage in it, and I ended up pulling a lot of that out. And I was like, let's use this as an opportunity to talk about some of the stuff that Pascal talks about when we're not on air and someone says, is this entire episode meant to be a meta trigger of Pascal? Not necessarily. It actually is a romp down a bit of memory lane for him. But let's keep in mind his time in New York, the 70s and 80s were, it was a very different New York in this time.
No doubt. No doubt.
And Pascal sent me this quote that I want to read to you guys. In September 1977, Mayor Ed Koch, a congressman and lawyer, won the Democratic primary over law professor Mario Cuomo, later governor of New York State, in a tough election fight. In 1977, New York City was a one-party town. There was no credible Republican challenger in the general election. Mayor Koch promised that this would be an administration that would face reality, and he assured voters that he would support the highest fiscal integrity. Mayor Koch, elected 3 4-year terms from 78 to 90, was committed in his first term to regain access to the public credit markets by presenting balanced and carefully crafted budgets after the ravages of the 1975 fiscal crisis. He returned the city to fiscally conservative policies dramatically different from the pre-fiscal crisis days. Mayor Koch maintained that redistributive functions were best left to the national government. He acted with the chutzpah appreciated by New Yorkers when taking on the unions in 1980 and winning, quote unquote, in a citywide transit strike. He was also contentious and pugnacious, quick to disagree with others, and aggressive in defending his positions. Within the first year, he alienated a large portion of African American voters by insisting on closing Sydenham Hospital in Harlem over widespread protests. A year later, he kept open the public health hospital on Staten Island, a borough dominated by the white working class. He further alienated progressive voters and African Americans by implementing harsh policies on welfare benefits in the city's social services agency, the Human Resources Administration. He supported his commissioner, Blanche Bernstein, who implemented policies to curb fraud in welfare payments by closing cases if notices were ignored and requiring face to face recertification meetings. His best friend, law partner, and corporation counsel, Alan Schwartz, described a major meeting between Mayor Koch and the African American leadership when Mayor Koch was abrasive and confrontational with his audience. I was stunned. Ed Koch was setting a tone that would create problems for him in the future. Deputy Mayor Basil Patterson, the highest ranking African American in the Koch administration, was so upset that he walked out of the meeting. The alienation and anger of African Americans who constituted 25% of the mayor's population grew throughout his administration. That is from Follow the Money, Who Controls New York City Mayors by Lynn Weikart. Pascal, you
Yes.
sent that to me today. And before we started the show, I went and watched again for maybe the fourth time a documentary about Yusuf Hawkins, who was murdered in Bensonhurst. Racial tensions were high. I was in New York in the early, I guess, mid 80s. I think I went to New York in 86 when Times Square was still gross. And before he was elected mayor, David Dinkins referred to New York City not as a melting pot, but a mosaic. As someone who was born and raised in the city, what say you to Dinkins' description of the mosaic?
I think if the mosaic was painted in blood, that would be a very good apt description
Whoa.
of New York City. Um, I'm going to be, I think people would come to this show expecting that I'm going to go into some kind of like waxing rhapsodic about the horrors and the racial horrors of New York City, how jacked up it was and how terrible it was. It's easy to do that, and I could do that. But I want to present a very balanced narrative of my experience in New York City. New York City is a huge city with a population of some would say between 8 to 9 million people. It has five boroughs. Boroughs are probably what you would call in another city towns. Now, for those of you who don't know, obviously if you don't watch the show regularly, I was born in the late 60s and grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s in New York. My parents were Haitian immigrants and moved to New York City in the mid to late 60s. Now, if you're not aware, in terms of the ethnic demographics of New York, even within the Black communities, if you will, in New York City, it's one of those few cities where even among Black folk, there's a significant amount of ethnic and cultural variation, which is not something you would get, say, from Chicago, Detroit, or maybe even Oakland or LA. In other words, you go to Oakland, you meet Black folk, they're either from Mississippi or Arkansas, and their parents have been in Chicago for several years. You meet Black folk from Detroit, somewhere in the South, in those areas. Black folk from Oakland, maybe their grandparents came from LA, but they are all generally African Americans whose ancestry can be traced to the South, many of them who came to the North or the West in various iterations of the Great Migration. What is interesting about New York City is that New York City is one of the few cities in the United States, maybe barring New Orleans,
Mm-hmm.
where, and maybe a few others, where there's a large presence of Afro Caribbeans, literally going back to the 19th century. All right. There are people coming from Jamaica and usually Barbados, but particularly Jamaica, coming to New York City even in the 19th century, early 20th century. If any of you are a fan of Ralph Ellison's book Invisible Man, which is one of my favorite fictional novels, when Ellison talks about Harlem during that period of time, he mentions the presence of the Caribbeans there. As a matter of fact, if you're familiar with left history in New York City or in America overall, you'll realize that many of the vanguards of Black left politics in the United States who came out of New York City were Caribbean. Cyril Briggs, Hubert Harrison, many of the members of the African Blood Brotherhood came out of the Caribbean as well. So New York City is a place where there is significant diversity in Black cultural expression, more so than you'll get in more places in more major cities in the United States. So, of course, the Great Migration. You have Black folk coming from the South in the early 20th century, starting in 1915 after World War One, going on into the 50s, so on and so forth. Most of the African Americans, from my experience, that came into New York usually came from North Carolina and Virginia. Also, what I would tend to find is that many of them tend to be, depending on what time period, they tend to have some level of job skills and more proximate to the middle class, barring a few exceptions that came in the later periods of the Great Migration. So, that being said, one of the hallmarks I remember about New York is that it was very common to meet Black folk whose parents were either Haitian, Jamaican, Trinidad, or African American from the South. And there was not any ethnic tension in New York within those communities. You didn't really find that in New York City, where there were tensions between various iterations of Black ethnics. Now, of course, when you're going to school and you're in elementary school, you're getting teased, you're getting picked on for being Haitian, so on and so forth. I experienced that, yes, for sure. But it wasn't as bad as what some Haitian kids were going through in Miami, which was really like a nightmare, like physical assaults. It was like terrible. But yeah, there was some of that Caribbean kids, African kids got picked up, and all of that picked on. That's true. But one of the reasons why I wanted to give balance to my narrative about growing up in New York, as much as I really talk about the racial horrors, is that I grew up in what, and this is going to sound strange coming from me, what was probably one of the most idyllic black communities in Queens, New York. I grew up in a town called Cambria Heights, which realistically, it was working class to somewhat middle class people. We had government workers, we had teachers, maybe occasionally you have a doctor or a corporate, like, human resources executive. But because there were many of the people who were coming from the islands and the West Indies, as well as the African Americans in the community, were very well educated. Many of them had college degrees, and some had good government jobs. It had the working class nature of the town really had more of an upper middle class aura. And one of the reasons I mentioned that, there was a 2006 article. I think I sent that to you, Jason. Do you have that?
No, you
There's
didn't.
a 2006 article. I think I emailed it to you about my town, literally Cambria Heights. It came out that talked about how blacks in this neighborhood in Queens had a higher per capita income than whites in that particular time, and how uh, that was an anomaly for not only New York City but for the country. And one of the towns that they talked about was basically Cambria Heights, where I grew up. So yeah, black income surpasses whites in Queens. This is a New York Times article from 2006. I'm getting for you right now, so Jason can share it. And it was. I mean, again, I'm not trying to make it seem like it was some kind of like bougie upper middle class area, by, but within the context of Jamaica Queens, it was considered kind of like an upper middle class neighborhood. It was a good way to really get a sense of kind of cultural awareness. And one of the things about New York City is that New York City, there's a strong sense of black nationalism because Harlem is in New York. So even though I wasn't getting imbued with any kind of actual history about black history in high school, I definitely had a sense of like a very healthy kind of pro-black identity. I was never ashamed of my race because I grew up in a very healthy black neighborhood. And even though I had to deal with this crap at my high school, it was just something we had to do. So I remember vividly when the news of Eleanor Bumpers, who was killed, I believe, by a police officer in New York City. I remember
And why
Bernard
was she
Getz.
killed?
Say again?
And why was she killed?
Well, I think I forgot what was the story behind Eleanor Bumpers. I
I
forgot.
believe they were serving an eviction notice, and she was being a little difficult, but she didn't have a gun. She was like 80 years old.
Right, right. So I vividly remember that. Bernard Getz was something that was really a point of contention because I
Can you
remember
explain
being
Bernard Getz a little bit? Because I think a lot of people don't know the whole Bernard Getz situation.
Bernard Getz was a white guy who was on a subway in New York City who claimed that a couple of black kids were trying to rob him or accost him, and he had a gun, and he shot one of the black kids, and then there was another one who I think was either running or trying to evade him, and he said, "Hey, you want another one?" And he bam, he took it and he killed him. I believe Getz was
He
acquitted.
said, and I quote, "You look fine. Here, have another."
Right,
That young man has brain damage to this day and is paralyzed.
correct. Bernard Getz was a major point of contention for me when I was in high school because I remember kids in my high school who were saying, "Free Bernie Getz." Bernie Getz was right. I mean, it was a big thing
Mhm.
where you really felt kids were like, "Yeah, Bernie Getz was the man. He didn't do anything wrong." That was like the real first.
But would you say
flashpoint.
there was a racial split at first? Because there's two. There's before they knew who he was, when he's still the subway vigilante, who ultimately the only reason why we know his name is because he turned himself in. They were never going to find him. Do you think that there was a racial divide, or do you think that a lot of people in New York, because I mean, let's set the tone and give some context. There was no transit police at the time. All you had at best were the guardian angels,
Curtis Sleeve and the Guardian Angels. I remember them too.
who were a multiracial coalition of vigilantes at best. So there was fear. I believe New York City might have been the murder capital of the country during this era as well.
There was a lot of crime in New York.
And Bernard Goetz claims that he was robbed and beat up. And in his confession, he admits that after being robbed and beat up, that he never wanted to feel that way again, because it wasn't the robbery, it was the beating up part. He felt he was emasculated by the ass kicking. Said he was thrown through a plate glass door.
Well, I can tell you right now, that's not the way Bernie Goetz was resonating in the consciousness of the black community of New York City at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Bernie Goetz was resonating as some white boy who murdered or tried to murder some young black kids. And in the context of the kind of racial hostility that black folk had experienced in New York City, in neighborhoods and by the cops, no one is exactly trying to hear his particular rationale. So Bernie Goetz was a point of contention as well.
Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out. You can catch the live stream of This Is Revolution every Tuesday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Time and Saturday, 9 a.m. Pacific Time. This is Revolution.